This is my favorite take on what philosophy is. Philosophy is the ungainly attempt to tackle questions that come naturally to children using methods that come naturally to lawyers. So as a philosopher of science in particular, I address questions about the conceptual foundations of science and scientific knowledge. And this includes a lot of the sorts of issues that Kathy and Richard touched on in their presentations. So questions like, how do we know that our models give us the right information we're looking for about things far away in the universe? What allows something to stand in for something else as a model in the first place? How do we even know what we know in the first place? And questions like, how do we reason about something that's so far away in space or so long ago in time or so beyond our reasoning capacities that we don't even know what the starting point is for thinking about it? So there's all these deep questions about science and scientific knowledge that I'm interested in and that philosophers of science do. And I'll talk a bit today about what I'm doing in the context of this group in particular. So like the slide Richard showed with all the various Bibles of cosmology, philosophers, of course, have our own specialized disciplinary methods and questions and problems that we like to puzzle about that often don't really involve reaching outside philosophy. But I believe that some questions can be answered only by genuinely reaching across disciplines, and in particular, bringing philosophy and science together, or better, bringing them back together, because as Kathy mentioned, it's quite a new thing, this idea that philosophy and science should be separate endeavors that live in separate departments and separate faculties at universities. And so I think these sorts of questions are the ones we've been talking about today, these questions that are really easy to ask and that come naturally to children and taxi drivers as well. So I want to just spend a few minutes telling you about one such big question in my own research at the moment, which is a question that concerns many of those in our founding group here at the University of Auckland, which is, what is life anyway? And when we ask this question, what we're really asking is, what distinguishes living things from non-living things? And as I'll get into in a moment, there are a lot of different reasons why we might care about this. So a starting point for answering this question, what is life anyway, is often to look around at the living world with all of its amazing diversity and complexity and variation, and ask, what do all of these sorts of things have in common? What do all of these things and others share with each other that they don't share with non-living things like rocks and tables and chairs and computers and other human artifacts? So that is a question that Western scientists and philosophers have been arguing about amongst themselves for about 2,000 years now. Aristotle is often cited as one of the first people to kick off this debate, talking about life in terms of having a soul that performs certain sorts of functions, and it's carried on through today. Today, there are exceptions, but most of this debate about the question, what is life anyway, tends to be quite insular. It tends to happen amongst philosophers arguing with themselves and publishing papers in philosophy journals about it, or within specific disciplines or subdisciplines in science. And as I'll talk about in a moment, there might be a number of different reasons to have a stake in this question that get buried when people are not talking across disciplines about it. So most people in this tradition of arguing about this question for the last few thousand years have thought that what we're looking for here is something like a definition of life, or a statement of the form, life is fill in the blank. And so far there have been, people argue about the numbers, but one recent paper counted 123 different proposed definitions of life that take that form. So there are many answers to this question that people have put out there. There's no movement at all towards consensus within these individual disciplines that have a stake in answering it, let alone across all of them. So this is a debate that I've been interested in for a while, but I'm becoming interested in it in new ways through this group. So just to give you a bit more of a sense of what this debate's about, one natural way to define what all living things have in common that they share, that they don't share with non-living things, if you just look at all of the different kinds of organisms I showed on the previous slide, an obvious sort of way to go with that would be to think in terms of biochemistry or DNA. So we might answer the definitional question I asked by saying life is something that has a certain sort of biomolecule, DNA or RNA. So that's a sort of straightforward, satisfying way to say what those things have in common that they don't have in common with tables and chairs and other things. But it's not so satisfying if you're someone like Kathy who's working on looking for life in the universe and trying to figure out how we could identify life forms on other planets far beyond those we're even familiar with. So if we're looking for life in the universe, in principle, we should be trying to look for something that could be made of quite different sorts of molecules. So that's one reason why starting with biochemistry might be appealing, but not a satisfying final answer to the question. So another sort of way to answer the question would be to think in terms of more functional features. So just to give one example, we might think evolution is really important to understanding what makes all those living things living and what makes other things non-living. So this is another sort of proposed definition that people have given here. Life is a system that evolves. That helps with the problem I just mentioned of being too materially focused, but it also ends up including all sorts of things that we don't think of as alive, like languages or software. If we just take evolution at face value, it seems right to say that language evolves, software evolves. So these are just two very quick examples, not at all representative of the full scope of proposed answers to this question, that I hope just to give you a sense of how this debate is really tricky. And again, I could go on about this forever because this is the sort of thing philosophers love to do. Someone proposes a definition, there's a counterexample or something that gets included that we want to exclude, and so forth. So in my own research thinking about this question, I'm not trying to do what many other contributors to it have done, which is to propose a new answer that I take to be the definitive answer or the final word on the definition of life. Instead, I'm thinking more and more that we need to rethink our approach to this whole question about what life is, especially because I think people have made a mistake in treating it as if there's going to be a single answer, and in arguing about the definition of life as if there were a single one-size-fits-all answer that applies to everyone who cares. So I think we need a somewhat more nuanced perspective on this question, what is life? And I think there might, in various senses, be something like a family of answers to the question that are connected to one another but tied to different empirical agendas and theoretical agendas across both philosophy and science. So in particular, I think there are at least three reasons, more probably, but I'll talk here about three reasons to ask what is life, and at least three different scientific agendas that are driven by those. So first of all, what astrobiologists are after when they ask the question, what is life, are often criteria for what to look for in the universe. This is a burning question because if we're going to find life elsewhere beyond the familiar sample of living things that I showed on the earlier slide, we need a robust definition that tells us what to look for. Secondly, researchers who are trying to explain the origin of life on Earth are after something like a really complicated explanatory target when they ask what is life. And in particular, they're trying to explain often a complex series of transitions that occurred on Earth roughly 4 billion years ago, how all these pieces came to fit together to take Earth at that point from something with only chemistry to something with biology. And then finally, in a separate research area of synthetic biology and artificial life as well, where people are trying to construct synthetic life forms from scratch in the laboratory or design living or lifelike software, both of which are areas that other members of our group work in. Often in those areas, when we ask what is life, what people are after is something more like a blueprint for building minimal, lifelike, if not living systems in laboratories or in computers. So these three sorts of projects, trying to find life in the universe, trying to explain how it arose on Earth 4 billion years ago, and trying to build it from scratch, are not at all mutually exclusive. Often people are working on all three together. But I think they're three quite different things to want from an answer to this question, what is life? So recognizing that different scientists and different philosophers are asking many variations on a single question for different reasons can help lead to more productive debate here. So I'll just wrap up by talking about two bigger points about why it's been valuable for me to pursue this research as part of this group. So first of all, just echoing something Kathy said earlier about clarity, I think we philosophers tend to sort of pride ourselves on clarity and our critical thinking skills. But for anyone, not just philosophers, when we leave our sort of disciplinary bubbles and engage with broader groups, that often can expose very entrenched ways, not only of talking, but of thinking. Like I said, we all have our own problems that we work on and ways that we think about them. And even if we're very clear amongst ourselves, that clarity doesn't always translate to the outside. So by really striving to make ourselves clear to others from different backgrounds, I think we not only gain clarity in what we're talking about, but we can gain clarity and insight into our own reasoning processes, which is hugely valuable for me as a philosopher trying to engage with science. And second, so my background is in philosophy and evolutionary biology, and this research I'm talking about here requires engaging with a lot of science beyond evolutionary biology, astrobiology, origin of life research, and so forth. So one way to engage with science as a philosopher is to treat it as subject matter, to read a bunch of articles and understand the material and go to talks and hear what people have to say when they present their research and really learn it. But I think the thing that really excites me about this center is that we're trying to do something more than that. So by entering into genuine dialogue with people from other disciplines, which is not always easy, but by really trying to do it, we can gain a whole lot more than just learning about new subject matter that might be relevant to our own research. And in particular, I think we can learn about other thinking processes and also the sort of new and risky and tentative and messy ideas that people grapple with every day. In other words, the kind of stuff that you don't get from reading papers and going to talks. And that's hugely valuable to me as a philosopher trying to really genuinely engage with scientific methodology and thought processes. So being in this group in these various ways, even just in the last year, has allowed me to genuinely incorporate these new perspectives on the questions I'm interested in and in turn change the way that I think about them. So the next step there, again, this is a new project for me, but a next step is sort of understanding how this quite Western-focused story that I've told about investigating life, how that fits with other worldviews and a sort of broader perspective on our understanding of what life is. And with that, I will hand things over to Dan.